How do we know if everybody's arrived? Or
I was just going to say, I think that we're nearly there. I think someone's just going to try logging back in because their audio was
okay.
But whilst just waiting, I'll do brief introductions. So first of all, I'm just going to mute everyone other than our key members this evening, just so that there's no feedback. Also, I want to just let you all know that we're recording tonight because we're going to put it up on YouTube or on social media, so just so that you're all aware. I'm Sarah, I'm from Sarah, but I'm actually going to pass over to John in a moment, who is going to lead the conversation this evening. And we've got Reiki has joined us to read as well, which we're really excited about. So one final thing, we're going to have Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions, either put them up in the chat or say that you've got a question in the chat, and I'll try and make sure that John knows who to call on at the end. I think we've got one or two lined up already. But I'm going to pass over to John now.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, good evening, everybody in Minnesota, Sweden, Cornwall, Cardiff. The whole world seems represented here. But we're going to start with the man of the moment, Euron Griffith. And I've known him for a long time. I can assure Dewi in Sweden that the humour is present in this English book. And we're going to try and get through the whole of the book without spoiling it in any way. But we will start, I suppose, Euron, by saying where it's set. And because it's set in northwest Wales, it's almost inevitable that Slate makes an appearance. And it makes an appearance because your family has a connection with the processing and dressing of Slate.
Well, yeah, my paternal granddad, John Griffith, who I never met because he died in the early 50s. He came home from the quarry one night, apparently, and just sat in his chair and just kind of fell asleep and passed away peacefully. But he was quite young, and but he was an artisan. He was somebody who was a craftsman. He could actually get a piece of slate and just knock it like that and get these perfect swooning pieces of slate together and all the right thickness and all the correct piece or whatever. So he never worked underground. So he was a very valued member of the kind of slate community. And of course, slate was enormous in North Wales. I was up in North Wales over last weekend, and you can still see the evidence of that, you know, because the mountainside, there's all these kind of slate heaps and whatever. It's a bit like the coal in South Wales, really. It's the equivalent of that, and it was, of course, enormous. I mean, I'm not an industrial historian, but I'm sure that, you know, at one point in the early 20th century, then the Dinorwig quarry was one of the major kind of exporters of slate to the whole of the rest of the world.
Well, on the industrial history bit, in 1714, the Penrhyn quarry itself exported 450,000 individual tiles to Dublin, but I digress.
I knew I could rely on you for that kind of information.
It is possible to actually see your book then, pretty much like your grandfather, because he was actually preparing these little bits of slate, and the structure of the book is like that. There are little thin chapters, and they all total up to a picture of family. I suppose family is the theme of it. So let's introduce people to the family by, if you like, breaking down the title of the book. Daniel. How close is Daniel to your own dad?
He was obviously the character of Daniel is based very much on my dad. Not everything in the book is actually, you know, you could say that it really happened. Whatever, some of it's stuff I'm conjecture. But when I was a kid obsessed with football, I always used to ask him about his time at Bolton Wanderers, because he had a trial with Bolton Wanderers as a goalkeeper. He was a very gifted goalkeeper. He played for Carnarvon Town, he played for Holyhead, he played for all these local teams. And in those days, of course, these teams were actually covered by national newspapers like the News of the World. They had their regional papers. And he showed me his scrapbook, and my favourite headline there was "Goalkeeper Griffith breaks little finger." Obviously, he'd gone for a huge save there, and he broke his finger. And that was worthy of coverage. So I thought, well, if that's worthy of coverage, he must have been important, you know. But as a kid, he took me to see Bethesda, and it was just like they played virtually in the field. and they took a free kick, and I was only about 8 years old, and I was right behind the goal, and the guy took a free kick, and the guy missed the goal, and the ball came straight towards me at something like 50 miles an hour, and I was transfixed by this ball that was about to break my nose, and out the blue, this hand appeared and just thwacked the ball away, and it was an example of my dad's superb goalkeeping instinct, and he saved not only the ball from going in the net, which was not behind him anyway, but he saved me from having a broken nose. So I just remember that part of my dad, because football played an enormous part in his life. He used to wear a suit, his best suit, on FA Cup final day as a mark of respect for the game. I mean, in the days when football wasn't covered on television as much as it is now, the FA Cup final day was a major event if you're a football fan. And we used to get down, and I'd go down for breakfast, and he'd be there in his suit and his tie, and he'd be there watching the build-up all day in his suit. And I said, which team are you supporting, Dad? He said, I never support one team. I come and see two teams, not one team. And it's always stayed with me, that, even though I'm a rabid Cardiff City fan, who of course are playing tonight.
There's a lot about football allegiance in it as well, because of course there's the opportunity to go and play for a team outside of Wales and so on. And in that sense, you have a character riven with, on one hand, loyalty to the local side, which has been supportive of him, the influence of the coach saying, well, you can have success, but it will be at our cost and so on. So it's very detailed in terms of football. And you and I, of course, parts company on this because I'm a rugby man and you're a football man. But there's obviously a lot of love behind you writing about football. And you've just explained that one of the main models in your life was a good footballer. So you can actually say that already. You've got Slate as a component of the North Wales life. You've got football as another. And of course, your dad was a poet. And one of the other subjects in the book is not just poetry, Welsh language poetry in Cynhanedd, strict meter, but also is about a competition as fierce, if not fiercer than football, which exists between bards in the senior tongue of Wales.
Well, yes. I mean, I think writers tend to be competitive, whether we like to admit it or not. We always are. And it's like anything, really. I think in the days when, I still play in bands now, but when I was younger, it used to be far more of an important thing. And yes, I used to grin and bear the kind of wonderfulness of the bands, but really I hated them because really all I cared about was my band. And we are very competitive. It's a competitive world, I was in a band called The Third Uncles. Our main rivals were a band called Papa's New Faith, who I thought were rather good. I loved them dearly, but I also was hugely competitive with them. And I think I can appreciate that. My dad, God rest his soul, was never competitive. I couldn't understand that. But other people used to be competitive about him, or so I imagined, So I got that impression because living in a small village, you've got that sense of competition. But yeah, poetry, writing, whatever, football, it's a different kind of competitiveness. But I think possibly football is or sports generally, is a more honest kind of competitiveness than the kind of backbiting and bitchy kind of writing kind of jealousy and petty kind of rivalries that go on. I don't know. And I wanted to tap into that a little bit because some of that in the novel is based on reality. Not all of it, but it's kind of been used as a kind of thing. I don't want to go too much into spoilers because I'm aware that most people here haven't read the book yet. So but there is that element, and some of that is based on stuff that I knew to be true. So.
Luckily, your dad was a winner of the crown, not the chair. So, in fact, you can't actually say it's his life because he wasn't actually working in strict meter.
Well, no, he often said that he could write Cynhanedd, he could do Cynhanedd, and he often taught me Cynhanedd, and he tried to when I was doing my O level in Welsh. But he said, "I'm not a poet in Cynhanedd." And that's the difference, really. So the poem that he wrote that won the crown in 1989, was in free verse, really. So, but curiously, on a little tiny digression, he never felt it was his best poem. His best poem he felt was the one that came second a few years before then. And I remember asking him about poetry and writing because I dabbled in poetry myself, although never in Welsh. And he said, you know, the happiest night of my life was when I spent all night writing 2 lines, and at about 6 or 7 in the morning, I decided they were both rubbish and scribbled them out. And he felt so relieved at doing that. And I've identified with that since then, because I've done that several times, not so much with poetry, but with prose. Just something that's troubling you, and you think it's not quite working. There's a sense of release in letting it go, you know.
Okay, well, I think in order to get a flavour of the book now, we need to introduce our special guest reader this evening, one of the most distinguished actors on stage, screen and television, Reiki Ayola. Her timekeeping is brilliant because she's on Greenwich Mean Time, because she's in Greenwich itself. In order to set up the first reading, which of course, you know, if you've got a book about Wales, you need a strong Welsh mam. But also in the background, you almost as certainly need a strong Welsh grandmother or 9. So the scene that's going to give us the first flavour of the book is a scene about 9 and 9 who's explaining angels.
When you die, an angel takes you from your coffin and leads you to a long staircase which comes down from the clouds. At the top of these moving stairs, there's a man called St. Peter, and he's got a very big book in front of him with names of everybody who's supposed to come up that day. Why has he got names in there, 9? Because he's been watching to see if you've been good. Like Santa. So Peter's far more important. So Peter decides if you've been good enough to go through the big iron gates to heaven. What do the gates look like? Very tall and heavy. They're made of iron and painted black. But wouldn't they fall through the clouds and come crashing down? I embellished my question with a descending whistle followed by my best explosion noise and described a circle of smoke with my arms. They don't fall through, said 9. Maybe things were different in heaven. Maybe after we died, the laws of physics and gravity didn't apply. If anybody knew about these things, 9 did. She read her Bible every day. What's heaven like, 9? I sat forward with my head in my hands. 9 smiled and thought about it. Well, I want you to close your eyes and imagine the most beautiful place you've ever seen. I closed my eyes tightly. I thought of the Marine Lake Fun Fair in Rhyl. Are you imagining it? I nodded as hard as I could. Good. What can you see? A roller coaster. Well, there aren't any of those in heaven. Heaven is full of peace and quiet. It's where God lives. Does God have a house? Of course. Does it have stairs and a toilet and a fridge and stuff? I don't know about that. But he must have a fridge to keep his milk in and to make sure that nothing goes off. I sensed that 9 was getting annoyed by all the questions about fridges. Everything that's important down here, she said, is not considered very important at all in heaven. Not fridges or television or pop music or anything like that. Heaven is about salvation. It's about being at peace with God. If you're good, and you go to chapel and to Sunday school, and you do what you're told like your dad did when he was a little boy, and if you behave and devote more time to reading your Bible, then maybe you will get to heaven one day. But I'd have to die first. We all have to die. I don't want to. Nothing to be scared of, said 9, making me jump when her hand touched mine. If you've been good, then it will all be fine. But I wasn't good. I hardly spent any time reading the Bible. 9 had given me a brand new one for Christmas, and although I flicked through it to try to find any exciting bits, I'd given up pretty quickly in favour of the TV Tornado Annual, which Santa had stuffed into my stocking. I was bad in other ways too. I picked my nose in chapel and wiped balls of snot under the pew. What counts as being bad, 9? Stealing, lying, swearing, taking the Lord's name in vain, not doing what one is told, refusing to eat Betty's carrots. burping? Burping always goes in the book. I had refused to eat carrots hundreds of times. I shoved them to the corner of my plate every Sunday and squashed them with my knife to make them look smaller so that no one would notice. But St. Peter had probably noticed. He had X-ray eyes. And I burped all the time. I only said, "Excuse me," when Mum nudged me under the table with her foot. I wondered if St. Peter had heard me when I'd said fuck after dropping a shilling down a drain. He probably had X-ray ears too. "I'll never get to heaven." "Then you must pray. Pray to God and he will hear you. You will tell Jesus, then Jesus will tell St. Peter." Heaven must be a pretty special place if everyone wants to go there so much. Nine sighed, and I opened my eyes. She was glancing across at the photograph of my tide on the mantelpiece. John Meredith, the tide I'd never known. "It must be," she said, "because when me and your tide were very young, he promised me that if he died first out of the two of us, he would come back and tell me what heaven was like. When he did die, and after they buried him in
Llanyolen.
Thank you. Llanyolen, and again, please, I'm so sorry.
Llanyolen.
Cemetery. I waited for him night after night looking up at the stars. But he never did keep his promise. It was the only time he didn't. So yes, heaven must be really special.
So that answers who we're going to get to read the audiobook version of
Yes,
your
absolutely. I'm so sorry. I suddenly panicked.
No, I wasn't on about the Llanyolen thing. I was on about just how really beautiful the reading was. So I know you're here really to give us a few readings, but it would be remiss of me if I didn't ask you this question, Reiki. You've read the whole thing now. You're actually one step ahead of most of the people who've gathered here convivially this evening. Did you like it?
I loved it. Yeah, I really did. No, I really did. I read it really quickly. And I'm apologising to all the Welsh speakers for messing up. I suddenly, my heart's pounding reading to you all. I do apologise for that. I really loved it. I read very, very slowly. It takes me ages to read a book. And I read this one quicker than I've read a book for a long time. I couldn't, and I sort of managed to read it in one sitting, which is not like me at all, because I usually drift off. What I loved about, drift off to imagine what I'm reading. What I loved about this was you've got little, what I thought of as jigsaw pieces coming at you from all over the jigsaw. You're in the present, you're in the past, you're in the future. And it's just the joy when you realize where the piece fits in the story was so delightful. I was really excited. So it's as if you get these little prizes when you work out the connections between the family. It's really lovely. So yeah, I think you've all got something really special to look forward to.
I've noticed that we've got some people drinking neat gin this evening. Euron is drinking some Stella. There's some cups of tea.
How can you tell it's Stella from there?
Yeah, but Reiki, you've been drinking some really odd stuff this evening.
Yeah, I know. That's freaking me out too. Just before we opened up, I had a cup of coffee and I downed it very quickly because the water in the kettle was lukewarm, which I thought would be perfect. My husband then said, "Don't drink the water in the kettle. I'm descaling it." So if I suddenly start turning green, you'll know.
Or your voice drops an octave.
Yeah, exactly. I have literally had half a cup of coffee of kettle descaler.
Okay, well we've worked at it. In all seriousness, you would do a brilliant job of reading the book, and also if someone was typing down what you've just said about it, the jigsaw and how they all fit together, that would make a great blurb for the reprint if we do our job well this evening. We'll come back to you in a moment, Reiki, after we've met Miriam. Miriam, of course, is another title character in the book, and without being cheap and glib, I presume there's some connection between Miriam and your mother, Euron.
Oh, yeah, well spotted, John. Yes, yeah, there
You
is.
see the theme emerging now, where he gets his material from.
There is, yeah. It's curious. I mean, this book started out, believe it or not, I was on the radio one night, contributing to the late great Alan Thompson's evening program, as I often did, about some kind of musical matter, and I was talking about the Beatles, and we were both Beatles obsessives, and he said, you should really write a book about your experiences, with the Beatles. I.e., I've never met any of them, but they were obviously part of my life, and being an obsessive about them or whatever, and thought, these kind of musical memoirs, it's almost become a genre in itself, really. I'm thinking of Giles Smith, Lost in Music, David Hepworth's fantastic music books, Stuart McInerney started with Roadies, all these kinds of books. I thought that's what the starting point was here. And I gradually discovered as I went on that I was becoming less interested in the Beatles element of it and more in what I thought was my family history, because there are so many elements of my family history that I don't really know, but are yet quite intriguing. Some of them are based on photos I've seen in photograph albums and whatever. And I thought, what? I didn't know this happened. I didn't know that. I'm trying to fit that jigsaw thing that Reiki was going on about, the trying to make it into a whole picture. So that's what this book is. It's some of this stuff may be stuff that I've imagined, but I feel that some of it may well have been stuff that might have actually happened. For instance, I knew that my dad had a trial with the Bolton Wanderers in his case, and I knew that they wanted to have him, but I was never that clear as to why he didn't go. So and similarly, the stuff with the wedding, which we'll hear about in a minute. I mean, I never quite knew the story of that. All I've seen are the pictures and what I imagined it to have been like in those days. So it was a matter of trying to fill in the blanks of my own family history, really, and also stories that I knew about that I've been telling my friends for years. And my friends have been saying, oh, you should really write about that because that is such an amazing story. I said, well, yes, I could, but I had to disguise certain elements of it because to protect the innocent and the guilty. So that is something that frightens me, actually. People who might read this book who are from the village of Bethel, where this is based, who might be reading it thinking, oh, I remember that happening. But it's obviously, I've tried to change. It has been changed, obviously. But taking elements of your own personal history and kind of weaving it into something new. Hopefully, that's what I've been trying to do.
But also, there's a difficulty there because if you're writing about people you know and love, but you're turning them into characters, if something happens to that character, it reminds you about the pain you went through when, for instance, your mother did actually hurt her leg back in the 90s.
She did, yeah.
And also, she was actually very seriously ill at one point. So that actually must be, on one hand, quite difficult to tap into old experiences, but also quite useful because you're already charged with emotion when you write about those moments.
Yeah, although you also feel rather callously in control of your material, and you can adapt and change it to fit the book. There are elements of it that did happen. Yes, indeed, my mum, bless her, did hurt her leg at the end of the 60s, and there was a time when we thought she would die. Of course, they hid this from me, sent me to a different school, sent me to live with my grandparents, and I didn't know anything about it. I mean, I haven't touched on that particular element of this book, but you do get an element of Daniel's story through that. So there. Which I don't want. It's really tricky because most people haven't read the book, so I don't want to give any spoilers here. But yeah, she went through a difficult time at the end of the 60s, early 70s, and I was just a child, really.
So that we can actually find out a little bit more about Miriam. Obviously, this was a time when chapels were in full strength. They were exerting, their moral authority over everything. And one of the worst things that could happen in that period was to have a child out of wedlock. And obviously, that's, again, one of the themes that locates it at a time when, there was that period when Wales was one of the most secular countries, most religious countries in the world. And, from 1904 onwards, the country was filled up with Old Testament names like Hebron, Gerazim and Pisgah, whatever. And of course, therefore, if you're going to have a wedding in a novel like yours, it's going to be that sort of wedding. So, Ricky, maybe you'd like to, there won't be church bells because chapels don't have bells, but maybe we can hear the equivalent in the background.
The wedding took place 6 weeks later on a chilly Saturday in March. If anyone had asked Miriam what Mr. Eugene Lloyd, the minister, had said to her in his blessing, then she wouldn't have remembered, and she doubted if her new husband, standing as stiff as a grenadier guard beside her, would have either. Something about love, no doubt. But this wasn't love. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She wasn't supposed to feel like she wanted to cry. She could feel the baby squirming inside her as the minister droned on and on and on. It was as if it wanted to get out of there, out of the range of prying and judgmental eyes that were behind her and above her, out of Pantglyn, out of the county. But this wasn't going to happen. The writhing creature inside her had tied a knot around her life. She should have hated it for killing her dreams, but despite everything, she loved it. At that moment, she knew that it was the only thing she loved for certain. All those people watching, each one of them grateful it wasn't them. Daniel took the ring from his best man, someone called Gwilym, who she'd never met before, and pushed it onto her finger. It wouldn't fit properly, and he had to try not to look as if he was forcing. She smiled at the minister as if nothing was wrong. Finally, she had to repeat his words and say, "I do." And that was that. They were married. She'd expected trumpets and angels. That's how she'd envisaged her wedding when she'd been a little girl. There would be choirs and dancing children, and the whole of Pantglyn would be out with banners and balloons to cheer and to celebrate. And now, all that happened was that everyone sang a mournful hymn, and after that the minister shook her hand. The Gwilym man, who she'd never met before, shook her hand too and pecked her on the cheek. He nodded at Daniel, and after the ceremony, she never saw him again. Outside, there was a photographer who herded them together as if he was in a hurry to go somewhere more exciting. The rain was icy and the wind was like a mischievous child lifting skirts and ruffling up hair. Miriam posed with Daniel, holding a little bouquet of flowers like a prize at a fun fair, and she smiled as hard as she could. Daniel's face was frozen into a smile she couldn't read. Leah came up with a concerned face and asked her if she was warm enough. Her arms were bare, she said. She didn't want to catch pneumonia. She offered Miriam a cardigan, but she refused it. This was a wedding day, and there was no way she was going to wear a cardigan. Gladys leant forward to give her new daughter-in-law a dry kiss on the cheek. The car was waiting. It was a Ford Anglia driven by a man in a suit who, when he saw them approaching, spat out his rollie and killed it with the heel, as if it was a cockroach. He opened the door for her, but it was a two-door model, and so he pulled the front seat forward to make room for her in the back. There was no need to gather in the long trail of a wedding dress because she was wearing a plain green outfit Elynyd had bought her from Nelson's in Carnarvon. Elynyd had asked her for a larger size than usual. Miriam looked out at the diminishing crowds outside the chapel as they smiled and waved, all of them desperate for the car to go so that they could return to their homes. The driver started the engine and the Ford Anglia pulled off. In the mirror, Miriam watched Pantglyn fall away like something suddenly cut loose. They were going to pick up the suitcases to go on their honeymoon. Daniel had booked a weekend in London. On the Saturday, he took her to Stamford Bridge to see Chelsea play Arsenal.
Thank you.
And he did.
Okay. So that's set it in aspect. Therefore, it's become history now, not just a part of a novel. So we've talked about two component parts of the title of the book. Then there's the me, and Helen Hughes cunningly has sent a question which says, "So, Euron, do you think this book is a rather badly disguised autobiography, Where are you in it? Are you the me in the title, or are you far removed from that?
Well, I'm not far removed from it, but I'm not, you know, I'm I'm hopefully not badly disguised, but you know, it's a character. I mean, in the same way that all of these people are characters, there are bases in reality for all of these characters. For instance, the one thing I can safely tell you from that piece that we've just heard is that my dad did take my mum to Stamford Bridge to watch Chelsea. The rest of it is conjecture, but it's what I assume possibly could have happened. But I don't know for certain. It's fiction, you know, as the bit in the first page of the very book, before you even read the book, said this is a work of fiction. Some pieces may have been used, whatever, or fictionalized. Well, it's something that I imagined could have happened. But I know that factly, because my mum used to roll her eyes and said, he took me to see a football match on my honeymoon. I can't believe it. But hey, you know, so yeah, it's like that, really. There are elements of me in it, yes. But there are, you know, but it's not really me. Me is almost a character in the same way that the others are as well. As in fact, all of these people are. They're reflections of real people, and very often real people, you know, a conglomerate of various people that I've known, various events that did happen, but not necessarily in this fashion or in this context, but they're all true in a different way. Difficult to describe the difference between autobiography and fiction, really. It's as I'm sure you'd agree, John. You know, it's you have to use your own experiences and use them in a creative way, and hopefully in a way that's not going to hurt or damage people that were involved or who might read it. You know?
You live in South Wales now. You live in Cardiff. You know, we're sort of the same age, but don't you find that when you look back at those moments in your childhood, they may be a moment with a father, a mother, maybe an incident in Bethel or a football match on a field which has barely got any white lines around it, that they're very, very clear, they're very brightly illuminated, and that can really help the writer then, because when you see it in the mind's eye, cast back over maybe, you know, going on for half a century maybe, they're very, very clear and bright and animated moments in your own life.
Well, I mean, I know that a lot of the episodes in this book that I've finally managed to somehow crystallize into prose have been with me for a long, long time, and have found escape in various different books that I've tried to write over the years. Some in English, some in Welsh. You know, there are certain elements of my own story, my own experiences that I've used in some of my Welsh language books, for instance. Some incidents, like the I don't want to give any spoilers away, but there's an incident in this book with kittens. That has been used in various books that I've tried to write before and known that it would fit somewhere else much better. My dad always used to say this when he was writing. You know, he'd have always these, when I was a kid and I used to watch him, and he'd have loads of bits and pieces of poems that he would then discard and use in other poems. And when I was my kind of sniffy adolescent, I'd say, oh, but that's not really true to your art, Dad. But I didn't know anything, and he did. He knew that, you know, sometimes what you need to express that important thing is the right vehicle for it. And I suddenly felt when I was writing this book that there were certain episodes that I felt really fitted, and that kitten episode, and I know that most people haven't got around to reading this yet, so I don't want to ruin it, but that fitted in perfectly in this book, and there were so many of those that I thought, yes, that makes sense, you know. So it's a tricky one.
You said that in your conversation with Alan Thompson, where, if you like, the whole story of the novel began, you were being encouraged to tap into your enthusiasm for the Beatles.
Yeah.
And Beatles, of course, famously came to Bangor.
Yeah.
But the shift of the book is 12 miles down the road to Carnarvon, because while the Beatles are coming to Bangor, there's someone else coming to Carnarvon, and it's Prince Charles coming to the investiture in the town. And that's a dramatic backdrop to what's going on, because yes, people came out in droves and waved their Union Jack flags, but also in the background there were people who were very unhappy. And maybe before we talk about that bit of it, Ricky, you can read something about how one of those discombobulated natives felt about the fact that there was going to be this royal show in town.
With every passing year, it seemed as if the crown or the chair at the National Eisteddfod was getting further away from his grasp. For 5 years in a row, he'd stuffed his neatly typed odes into a brown envelope, making sure nothing got creased or bent, licked the seal and sent them off by first-class post. Why hadn't he won? Was there a conspiracy against him? In theory, that shouldn't be possible, since none of the adjudicators in a major literary competition of the crown and the chair at the National Eisteddfod ever received the entrants' real names until the winner had been decided. All they had were pseudonyms, so that nepotism and personal prejudice were both eliminated from the process. Records of the entrants' real names were kept in the Eisteddfod office under lock and key. The winners of both competitions were only informed by letter by the end of April, at the latest, and sworn to secrecy until the ceremony in August. If it wasn't the National Eisteddfods pitting themselves against him, then perhaps it was the English establishment. That made no sense, because the way the hangman saw it, there was nothing wrong with his poetry. His Cynhannedd was sound, watertight. So it must have been the politics. The forces of English imperialism had penetrated the inner sanctuary of the most prestigious Welsh language cultural event and deemed that poems which took political and cultural colonization as their central theme were too hot to handle in the year of the investiture of Prince Charles. He blamed the spineless Welsh traitors who'd allowed all this to happen. The arse-lickers like Secretary of State for Wales George Thomas, the donkey-like Welsh public waving their pathetic Union Jack flags, the gutless Welsh press with their sycophantic puff stories, the kowtowing mayor of Caernarfon, his ridiculous wife both wetting themselves with pleasure as they anticipated shaking hands with Prince Charles, the Prince, the Queen, and that oily warmonger Lord Mountbatten. He blamed the fag-smoking tart Princess Margaret. He blamed Harold Wilson and his weather-vane socialism. He blamed all of these people, but most of all, the hangman blamed Daniel. Are you following me? The hangman had stopped and turned around to face the two men. They were smaller than he'd expected, but then he'd only seen them sitting in the green Volkswagen outside his house. Now, standing in their suits and shades halfway along the path through the field which led towards the village shop, they looked out of place, almost exotic. We don't want any trouble, Mr. Evans. Who mentioned trouble? The two men looked at each other. The first one took a packet of Rothmans out of his suit pocket, shook a cigarette out of it, lit it, and flicked the match expertly into the long grass. These are sensitive times, Mr. Evans, he said, revealing a heavy London accent. The eyes of the world are going to be on this place in a few days' time, the investiture of your new Prince of Wales. Not my bloody prince. Now leave me alone. He turned to walk away, but the two men jumped ahead of him and blocked his path. The Londoner reached into the inside pocket of his suit and took out an envelope. Inside were what appeared to be a sheaf of newspaper cuttings held together with a clip. The Londoner read one out loud. The only way that Wales will ever be truly free is through violent struggle. Everything else has been attempted and everything has so far failed. The repressive English establishment cannot be trusted to respect and protect our culture, heritage, and language because their sole objective is to destroy it, just like their imperialist lust crushed the indigenous cultures of a third of the world under their barbarous empire. The Londoner looked at Hangman briefly for a reaction, but there wasn't one, so he started reading out the second clip. We should take our cue from the Irish, our Celtic brethren, and take up arms. The IRA are represented as terrorists by the politicians and the despicable media, but we know that in reality they are freedom fighters in a battle to the death with the very forces that are out to crush them. If the British government will not listen to our words, perhaps they will listen to the cries of their dying children. The Londoner looked up. I didn't write that, said the hangman. Then he reddened slightly. Well, not the last one. We know, said the Londoner. The second clip was written by a guy calling himself Cadno. Not his real name, obviously. Cadno's real name, as you probably know, is Clear Price. And he is, surprise, surprise, a member of that group of boy soldiers, the Free Wales Army, an organisation which I believe you have great sympathy for. Piss off, said the hangman. He tried to move on again, but the Londoner grabbed his shoulder. You know him, I think, this Cadno guy. I can't choose my friends now, is that it? Oh, so he is a friend. The hangman paused. He opened his mouth to say something, but thought better of it. There was a sense of a situation brewing which could easily get out of control if he wasn't careful. If these guys really were from the security services, then they could make his life very difficult if he did or said anything reckless. I can't say he's a friend exactly. The Londoner smiled, released his grip and stubbed out his half-smoked cigarette. But you sympathise. Am I allowed to sympathise? You tell me. If not, I'll just go along with the orthodoxy. I'll cheer the new prince and wave a plastic Union Jack. Is that what I should do? There's a list. What are you talking about? Known agitators, said the Londoner. Do you know where Clear Price is now? No. We do. Have a guess. Siberia? Brighton. What? Nice little break for all the family. Couple of weeks away by the sea, far away from all the everyday woes of his life as a teacher. And of course, far away from the investiture. When it's all over, we'll bring him back. Who knows? He may bring us a stick of rock. Oh, I get it. You're threatening to send me and my family away too, is that it? We just want you to be careful. Or what? I'll find a minibus outside the house to take me and the family to Scarborough. Is that how you deal with your known agitators now, is it? I tell you what, instead of wasting your time with all this nonsense, why don't you do something useful and get rid of those bloody hippies who've taken over Llysmyfr instead? The Londoner suddenly gripped the hangman's arm and dug his fingers so hard into his flesh it felt as if they were touching the bone. The hangman wanted to yell out in pain, but his pride wouldn't allow it. There were tears in his eyes. Take it easy, said the Londoner, his voice now a growl. Behave yourself. Be a good boy for 2 weeks, and that way no one gets hurt.
Great, fabulous reading, Reiki. In a sense, Euron, that subject doesn't come up, right throughout the book. In fact, lots of these subjects don't. They're sort of dealt with the complexity of what was going on then, and there's a very playful thing where the character he's being interrogated, the hangman's being interrogated about, is called Cadno, and of course the leader of the Free Wales Army was Caio Evans. So there are lots of things where you blur the reality. People did come from MI5 and Special Branch and tried to hunt down the people who were there. But even in that piece, you're actually saying, there were other things happening at the same time. It wasn't just the investiture and the way in which the British establishment tried to find out who was who, but also there were hippies coming in. Because at the end of the 60s, the Summer of Love and so on, there were these encampments, these communes of other people coming in. So if you put them all together, this jigsaw puzzle does give us a picture of what life was like then in that period of time along the coastal belt and into the slatey hinterland of North Wales.
Slatey hinterland, I love it. That should have been the title of the book. But yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I was a child when the investiture was on, and I didn't actually grasp the full political implications of it really, and I was quite enthralled by it, because you imagine being 8 years old and living in this village where nothing ever happened, and all of a sudden everything happened. you've got all these soldiers coming through the village. You got military, and I was obsessed with soldiers. I was, I loved war films. I loved all the commando comic books, and all these, people and horses and people with guns and cannons going through the village. My God, this was so exciting. This was brilliant. And my dad, of course, who objected vehemently to the investiture of the Prince of Wales, I couldn't really identify with that. I thought, why are you kind of moaning about it? And I was always good at drawing, so I was always drawing the kind of insignia of the Prince of Wales, this kind of three-feathered Ichtien kind of thing, and I got really so good at drawing this. And I used to show him the drawings and said, Dad, look, I've just done this. And he'd go, yeah, very good. And he was not in approval of it at all. And my mum was actually quite enthralled by royalty. And I remember one of the rehearsals for the investiture, she wanted to go and see Lord Snowdon and Princess Margaret as they arrived in the castle. And because, of course, Lord Snowdon organised the whole event. And I stood with her in Carnarvon Mice for ages. But all the time I was thinking, I really want to go into that newsagent's behind us in Grey Thomas in Carnarvon and buy the Beano Summer Special. That's all I cared about. And I wasn't interested at all in seeing Lord Snowdon or Princess Margaret. But she was obsessed with it and wanted to, no, you stay there, you stay there. I said, but Mum, they're going to sell out. And, I'm going to be without my Beano Summer Special. And eventually, after standing there for hours, it seemed like, she said, okay, come on then. And she took me into Grey Thomas and bought me the Beano Summer Special. And I was happy, but she wasn't happy when she came back, because in that 2 or 3 minute gap, Lord Snowdon and Princess Margaret had arrived in their stagecoach and gone inside the castle and disappeared. She really told me off for that. So that whole thing, we forget, but Carnarvon was festooned with the Union Jacks. They loved it. And of course, we're aware of this now. We look back on it and we realise that a lot of the nationalist element in Wales were their worst enemies in some ways, were the very Welsh people who actually supported all this. So it was a very real thing. And the character of the hangman, is somebody who is based on several kind of different elements of different characters, but that he's a representation of that kind of belief of people who objected to this, which is obviously it was a huge thing at the time.
Things are going really according to plan now, because Deborah has this question. She says, the split slate jigsaw structure goes backwards and forwards in time. How did you light upon the structure, and did you want the reader to have the experience of filling in the gaps of your family history in the way you did?
Well, possibly, yes. I've never been a great fan of things that start and finish. I've always liked to, in a linear fashion. I've always liked the idea of playing around with the form, because I think for me, part of the joy of writing a long form piece like a novel is to actually find the structure for it. To find, once you found that structure, then I think it becomes easier to write. Obviously, you don't start with that. I mean, I remember starting this novel virtually. I remember showing you, in fact, a very early draft of this book, and you suggested kindly and perceptively that it shouldn't start there. It should start at a different point, and it made me go back to it and re-look at it. And that is true. As soon as you discover the key into the book, you think, that's it. The whole thing then becomes clear, and then it's easier to get things together and write things together, because it didn't originally start where this book currently starts, which is with the character of Nine, my grandmother. It started with the story of Miriam, and but I thought it'd be really good to, well, you suggested this to me, and it would be good to start at a different point. So I think it's all a matter of finding a key, and then all these different slate bits, as you describe them, come together, because then you think, oh yes, well in that case it has to make sense, because I draw and I paint, and I think there's a certain harmony to a painting or a drawing. You've got to find this, you've got to find the rhythm of a piece, the rhythm of shape and color and darkness and light, and that is similar in writing fiction, I think, or anything, poetry, fiction, drama, whatever.
Someone called Judith has fed in a good question. Why did you write this book in English when your others were in Welsh?
Well, I was kind of anticipating that kind of question, but it's curious because I felt that my Welsh language books were almost novels in translation anyway, because in my head, I'd already written them in English and I had to translate them. But the first novel I wrote, Din Pobin, I had to actually go through a grammatical correction thing on Google to correct my grammar, because I always felt underconfident with my Welsh. You know, I always felt my English was better than my Welsh. When I was at school, my English was always better. It was my strongest subject, and my heroes always tended to be from the field of English literature rather than Welsh literature. I don't know, they always have done. You know, my favourite poets are all people who've written in English rather than Welsh, and generally speaking, my fiction heroes also. So there were reasons why I wrote those books in Welsh, but I think certainly with Tridec Tri, my last Welsh book, I felt that was an English novel in Welsh, and you know, and actually, one of the things I want to do is I want to explore the possibilities of translating that, because what you describe as playing with time, playing with various things like that, and linear progression in literature, that was certainly true of that book, because I think you've read that book, John, so you'd probably agree that it has got a weird, rather challenging structure to it, which makes sense once you approach the end of it, which is something that I've always been intrigued by, and something I like fiction as puzzle, you know, because I think it should be puzzling. It should never be easy. If it's easy, then great, but it's not my way of doing things. I like you to work hard and say, oh yeah, I see that connection, I see where that's going, and I see where that is, and that makes sense to me now. And some of that is influenced by film as much as it is by fiction.
Time probably for just one more question. Helen Hughes has been feeding in not only statements like please do the audio version with an emoji heart, so that's directed at Reiki and Seren, but then she's got this other question, which is do you think there is a similar jigsaw of cultures now, or was this a point in time?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I think we live in I think we have about 20 or 30 different versions of Wales, I think, and 20 or 30 different versions of England, 20 or 30, I'm sure, more different versions of Scotland. So they're all jigsaws, you know. So my main fear is that sometimes you see these things as simple demarcations and simple political borders, but they're not. You know, we're all massively complicated beings, massively different, you know, even though we exist within a certain space, whether it be geographical or time or anything like that, or political or in any way. So I think we live in a complicated period, and we always have done. We're always complicated. Humanity is complicated, you know, and it's part of our, I don't know, to sound grand, my God, it sounds so grand, but it's part of the person who writes anything to try and create an order out of that apparent chaos. You know, it's part of the job to try and make that apparent, or trying to explain an interpretation of it to a reader, whatever, and they may agree or disagree with it, but that's what I felt. It's possibly easier with hindsight, because looking back now over history and of Wales in the late 60s, early 70s, obviously I grew up in the early 70s, I mean, in a small village, and I know that background intimately, so I feel that I can write about it expertly. But yeah, it's oh gosh, it's a huge question.
We could expand on this, and we could move on to talking about music in the book, because of course there's an epigram by one of your other musical heroes, Mark Bolan. There's all sorts of things we could actually pursue, but we're running out of time. It remains to me to thank Reiki not only for surviving the descaler in the kettle, which was in the coffee that she drank, but also for reading beautifully, and also for being the most enthusiastic salesperson who could pitch, you know, buying this book now at the collective audience who here this evening. So, Reiki, thank you very much over there in Greenwich. Let me just say that Euron actually said about writing about this period and these places with authenticity. It is sharp and bright with that sort of authenticity. The people who know him will hear a little bit of his voice. The people who know him will also hear a bit of his humour, because it was Euron Griffith who actually had the best put down for any heckler I ever saw at a Third Uncle's concert, because someone actually shouted out and Euron fixed him with a gimlet eye and said, "You'd make a good stranger." And it was just one of those fantastic lines, just as we've heard some of those lines today with the twisted baby caught within the mother who is going to blight that woman's life and so on. So it's full of good lines. It's full of a great slate-light building of, I suppose, the house you once lived in, the people you knew. But as you said, it's not autobiography. Neither is it autofiction. It is fiction, but it's actually beautifully presented fiction. And I'm sure that all of us who've convened here this evening wish it well, and don't forget to buy a book, because that's how authors pay for the stellar artwork that he's doing at the moment. So thanks very much indeed. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd.
Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.